All right, the book we're using is written by Donnie Rader. He's preached here several times. We're all very familiar with him. He writes exceptional class material, and so I would strongly encourage you to, as you're studying the text, use this as a companion. Always, the text is primary, but certainly these kinds of workbooks can be very helpful to us, and I would encourage you to make full use of that as you can. It really functions as a concise commentary, and he quotes from several commentaries in it, but the layout of it is done very well, and it certainly helps us to grasp this very important book. I've recently, with some men in this congregation, had a smaller study, and we used this book, and is a blessing to us. So I'm very confident that this will be a blessing as well in this quarter. But with that being said, the introductory material is just kind of like this. A lot of it is just kind of, it is what it is. So we're going to stick very closely to the material he's compiled. There's no reason to go away from it. But there will be some things that we can talk about, and I encourage your comments and perhaps even in questions. And we'll get through this, and we'll get into the text, Lord willing, on Wednesday. We'll cover chapter 1 in 2 classes, of course. So he gives some attention in those first couple of paragraphs to just encourage us to stick to meaty passages and books like this. The book of Hebrews is pretty deep, and if you never thought it was deep, it's probably because there's some things that didn't quite click with you maybe, because it is a deep book, and it functions as a contrast between the Old and the New Law, but it also gives us some of the mechanisms of our redemption. It really exposes for us just what the Holy Spirit wanted us to see in the Old Testament system. And really what it is it's a book of exhortation, as he mentions in chapter 13, and as Donnie points out in the introduction. And it's an exhortation, as we just heard in those first 3 talks of our hour of worship we just finished, to continue running the race faithfully, because it gets hard, and they're in a hard period of time as the Hebrew writer is addressing these people. And that goes along with this concept of it being a meaty book, and I think we're going to see that in chapter 6, the end of chapter 5, and throughout chapter 6, because what that does for us is it shows kind of a parenthetical thought to his argument. He's about to talk about Melchizedek and his connection with Christ as the high priest and how important that is, but he says that that's a difficult topic. And he says that the reason why I can't just go into that right away is because you've not been growing. And so he gives an entire chapter to kind of get on to them and then encourage them to grow. And then he gets into it in chapter 7, which can be a very weighty passage to wade through. And I think we're going to be benefited by it. But when he talks about how we can be intimidated through this, and the depth of the book causes some to wonder why we even need to study it, I think that's what growth is all about as children of God. The reason they were struggling so much, the audience of Hebrews, this epistle, was because, in part, they were neglecting themselves of the very things Christ was trying to give them to strengthen them in the first place. And part of that is the nature of his priesthood and why it's so much greater than the high priesthood of Aaron and the priesthood and order under the tribe of Levi. And so that kind of fits right in there with that context of chapter 6. Listen, I want to talk to you about Melchizedek and how that parallels with Christ and why that makes Christ's priesthood so much better, because you need to know that. You need to desperately understand why Christ is so much greater, because if you did, you could tap into the strength that he provides that, again, we just studied about and heard about. But because you have not been growing like you should be growing, you can't go there. We can't get there yet. And so when we come across a book like Romans or Hebrews or even Revelation and we're extremely intimidated by it, we need to study it and study it and study it. And we're not going to get it clicking with us the first study. But as we get through it, eventually it's going to be so rich and helpful for us. Our faith is going to be strengthened. And there are going to be tools and weapons that God is providing for us in these rich texts that we did not have before we gave the time and attention to study them. So it's extremely important that we have patience as we study through these kinds of books. He goes on to say that if you need encouragement, then you should study the book of Hebrews. If you need Christ, and we just heard, we all need Christ. Everyone needs Christ. Then we should study the book of Hebrews. If you need to be reminded not to give up, Aaron did an excellent job in breaking down that concept of endurance in Hebrews 12, verses 1 and 2. We need to look to the book of Hebrews. You need to hear about the dangers of falling back. Go to the book of Hebrews. Turn to Hebrews 13 and verse 22. And we'll talk a little bit more about this concept of exhortation in a minute. But someone read Hebrews 13 and verse 22. Bear with the word of exhortation. What would that imply? He's telling them, bear with the word of exhortation. And don't be, there could be multiple answers to this. Anybody? Huh? Keep with it. Yeah. Okay, more specifically, maybe I can phrase it this way. What would it say about the nature of this epistle? Is it easy to hear? Are there things that are challenging in it? Is exhortation always just this fluffy, positive thing?
Constructive criticism is not always easily received.
Criticism. Yeah.
Yes, and this is very much a disciplinary letter for this congregation. They need to be told, look, guys, you should have had strength, but you don't. And so therefore, we need to go back and do these things again.
Definitely. And he spends a whole chapter in chapter 12 of saying, basically, stop moping around, buck up, and be faithful. This was for your good. And we need to be told that from time to time. And when we think about exhortation, you think that's the word used to describe Barnabas. He's the son of encouragement. Same word, exhortation. And I think sometimes we sell ourselves or cut ourselves short from what that concept actually means and how important it is for us. It's not just like, come on, you can do it. It could come in that form, but sometimes it comes with, as Rick was saying, constructive criticism. Stop doing this and start doing this. Or, you know what? You need to straighten up over here. You can do better here. Listen, guys, I know it's hard, but this is inexcusable. Get with it. And this is a very encouraging letter. But the fact that he says, you need to bear up with this, bear with the word of exhortation, tells me that there's something negative that people don't like to think about when it comes to exhortation. If I have to put up with something, bear with something. 2 Timothy chapter 4 says they will no longer put up with sound doctrine. If I have to put up with it, that implies that it's a challenge, that there's adversity that's involved in it as well, that it involves sacrifice, which is all about what we just looked at in chapter 13. Come outside of the city bearing his reproach. He suffered for you. You need to suffer for him. And so it's a positive thing. You can do it. Keep going. Be better. Do better. But that means lay aside the weight. Lay aside the sin. Bear up with it. Put up with it. Don't ignore it. Don't get all down in the dumps about it because I got on to you. Just take it and use it to better yourself. Aaron, did you have something?
When I think of that word bear, I think of it as being a weight.
Yeah.
And the idea then is that the idea is there will be encouragement, but it's going to weigh on you. And I really don't look at Hebrews as being what we would call a first principles lesson.
Sure.
I really look at it that this is the next level of understanding that you've got to get to truly understand what Christ has done for you.
Yeah, absolutely. It's easy to just say, well, he loves us and he died for us. And the Bible said that's what has to happen. Well, if that's all that God wanted us to actually understand about it, that's all he would have written, right? There's a lot of details to this. There are nuances to the scheme of redemption that fill in a lot of the gaps that are left in the minds of those who are immature that need to be filled because that's where error will come in. if I don't truly understand the way God intends to save us and why His blood saves us, and other things, then there are going to be false ideas that start sounding right to us and good to us. But if we understand these principles on the level that Hebrews gives it to us on, then we're going to be better equipped to fend off error as well. And that's what chapter 13 addresses too. Jesus Christ is the same yesterday, today, and forever. Don't be carried about with various and strange doctrines. You remember in Ephesians chapter 4 when he's talking about the edification of the church, he says that it's so that we can all come to a perfect man, a mature man, to the measure of the stature of the fullness of Christ, that we should no longer be children tossed to and fro and carried about with various winds of doctrine. And so we've got to continue to dig deeper and to find the deeper realities of the scheme of redemption so that we're not persuaded by false teaching. And that's a lot about what we see in Hebrews as well. So the title to the Hebrews is in the English text, the Epistle to the Hebrews, as you see at the top of your publication of the New Testament. The earlier manuscripts he mentions had the title to Hebrews. And what we've studied this last year to a certain degree, but when you think about the earliest manuscripts we have of a text of the New Testament, it is still several years, though very early, very close to the original autographs compared to any other writings of antiquity. It blows it out of the water. But it's not the original. No one has the originals. And you can kind of understand that. They're written on very vulnerable materials, and they're passed around and wear and tear. But the thing is copies and copies and copies and copies are made. And what they do is that they know where this comes from. It's been very early. They could ask the people who originally received it. And they start doing these things like reminding each other perhaps who wrote it, even if they don't have the name in the epistle. Or maybe even here is the title from its earliest knowledge that it bore. Not necessarily that the writer said the epistle to the Hebrews, but they knew who it was addressed to and what it concerned, and that's the earliest title we have. So this is the kind of stuff that introductory studies come from. And on top of that, when we start talking about who wrote it, that's called higher criticism. And if the epistle bears the name of its author, then it can be pretty simple. It's just a matter of authenticating it as true. But if it doesn't, then basically it's just highly informed guesswork, and we're doing our best with it. But it would be irresponsible to be dogmatic about it. But the early English text has to the Hebrews. Early manuscripts had to the Hebrews. And this is important. He quotes Milligan, this much is certain, the title was prefixed to our epistle at a very early date. Later enlarged to read the epistle to the Hebrews. This is important because of its content. It's very obvious that it was written to a Jewish audience, and one of the key thoughts to that is the title that the epistle bears. So he mentions Hebrew, the word, the term, is first mentioned in Genesis 14 and verse 13. There's some significance to this, and we'll get back to it as we progress as well. But in Genesis chapter 14 and in verse 13, it said, "Then one who had escaped came and told Abram the Hebrew, for he dwelt by the terebinth trees of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol, the brother of Aner," so on and so forth. Abram the Hebrew. And so immediately what we see is that this concept of Hebrew predates the nation of Israel. And I think that that's somewhat key. A lot of what we see in Hebrews has to do with the nation of Israel and the law that was given to them. But I think here's where you might have some of the struggle of pride that the Hebrews had in wanting to turn back to that system, is they had pride in their ancestors, Father Abraham. The significance was not simply that I'm a part of that economy and that law, but that we come from the father of faith, Abraham. And so this traces back all the way to this ancestor, Father And it meant foreigner because he was what? Why was he a foreigner? Here's the land I promised to you. Is it his yet? No, it's going to be your descendants, but he was a nomad. We see that in chapter 11, in fact, real quick with Abraham. He went out not knowing where he was going. They dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents with Isaac and with Jacob. So it means foreigner, but when we connect that with the Hebrew, Abram, then it's speaking about, when he refers to Hebrews, everyone who traces their lineage back to him. That's a big thing. But how do we trace our lineage back to Abraham? Physically, by faith. So you can kind of see there this disconnect. And Paul deals with that at length in Romans. Okay, you've got some pride there. You're the Hebrews. But Abraham and his descendants, it's not all about blood. It's certainly not all about the law. It's about having faith in God, having faith in Christ. And so you could see where maybe that would be a hang-up as well. Here's what we want to key in on. In the New Testament, it had a lot to do with language. He quotes from Milligan again on page number 5. In the New Testament, the name Hebrew seems to have always some reference to the language as well as the many other rights and privileges of the seed of Abraham. Vine, in his comments on this word, says that the word is an early generic term for a variety of Semitic people. So not just the family of Abraham, but other people as well. I mean, it meant stranger. It's somewhat akin to our word barbarian, he says. And so in the New Testament, when you see Jew and Greek, barbarian and Scythian, what is barbarian referring to? Now we think of, Conan the Barbarian. He's just this mammoth of a man that's really rough. What does barbarian mean?
Somebody who doesn't speak the language.
Yeah. Someone that doesn't, especially in a context with Jew and Greek, barbarian, it's the one who doesn't speak the Greek language. You had Jews, and then you had Gentiles, primarily in the Greek Empire, the Roman Empire, which spoke the Koine Greek language as the universal language. And then there were people that didn't speak that language. They were barbarians. And so it had a very specific connotation to it. He mentions that it's an ethnic term, which indicates family origin, whereas the term sons of Israel is a political and religious term. So when we're talking about the Hebrews, we're talking about not just the people that were under the old law, but the people who had that close connection with this blood relation to Abraham. And that would be very important. And so it was written to a Jewish audience. And we can understand that just by the very text itself. Comments, questions on that? All right. Who wrote it? Anybody? There was one time I remember I went back home and held a gospel meeting early in my time preaching. And I referred to the writer of Hebrews as Paul. It was just in passing. And it was funny because someone came up to me, and the only thing they got out of that lesson is that you don't know who wrote Hebrews. So be careful depending on who you're talking to. Certainly we should not be dogmatic about it. Evidently, Donnie Rader and I tend to agree with him because of the evidence. Feels very strongly that Paul probably wrote it. It doesn't really matter, but it is something that has to do with introductory material, so we'll talk about it. There's some pretty good reason to believe that the Apostle Paul wrote it. But just before that, Origen said who the author of the epistle is, God only knows. That's really true. It doesn't mean there's no evidence to lend to a certain conclusion, but it's certainly true at the end of the day, only God knows. Now, before we get further into that, there's no reason to doubt its authenticity. It was accepted very early on. Everything in it is true. It bears the marks of inspiration. There's no reason to doubt it at all, any more than there would be a reason to doubt some other epistle without an author or such. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, they don't have the name of the author in it as well. We get that through conclusions. But here's one of the things that we need to see in chapter 13, again in verse 19. It does seem personal. If it's not Paul, it's someone specific. It's not just this general epistle, as he'll talk about. It's someone specific writing to someone specific that he knows. It says, I especially urge you to do this, that I may be restored to you the sooner. That doesn't sound like a general epistle like James is referred to as a general epistle. Or 1 Peter, to those who are scattered abroad. It seems like there's a personal relationship within the people that are addressed in this epistle and the author. Here's some suggestions. Paul, Clement of Rome, Apollos, Aquila, Barnabas. Traditionally, Paul is the one who is favored. Luke, Mark, Silas, Philip the evangelist. So here's some evidence that the Apostle Paul wrote it. The early, what we would refer to them as church fathers, suggested that the Apostle Paul wrote it. In fact, except for one man, Erasmus, early on, that was pretty much ubiquitous. Everyone believed that it was Paul, and then Erasmus decided to make an issue of it. He thought someone else wrote it, and he took it to them during the Reformation. And so it's pretty well believed that Paul wrote it, though there's no objective evidence that here's his name, he wrote it, obviously. But there's plenty of objective evidence to suggest that he did indeed write it. One of those is the fact that it was anonymous. Why would that fit Paul? When you think about the content of the epistle, and hopefully you've read through it, 13 chapters. If not, I encourage you to do so before we get into the text. But knowing what it's about, and knowing how Paul came to be an apostle, and what things he had to deal with in his life, how might it being anonymous fit specifically Paul?
There's a chance that his name might cause the scriptures to be not listened to.
Yeah, not listened to. Why?
Especially to the Jews.
His past, right?
Especially to the Jews. Some felt he was a traitor.
Yeah. He went through a lot of that kind of adversity from his own countrymen. And it's interesting, it's just like these, and that's why I believe, like, if anyone was sent by the Holy Spirit to write an epistle to a people that were in this kind of need, it makes sense that it would be Paul, because he could very well relate to them. Now, there would be the challenge of them maybe listening with biased ears if they knew it was Paul, and so he didn't do that, but he would be able to develop an epistle that would be very helpful to them. The fact that it's anonymous. Remember in Acts 21, just as an example of that. Jason, did you have anything in addition to that?
I was going to say.
I was looking at you and I was like, Jason. James, Jason. So yes, because of his dealings with the Jews. In Acts 21 and verse 20, remember Paul is warned by many others and by the Holy Spirit specifically, don't go to Jerusalem, because what's going to happen? You're going to be bound, right? Remember, Agabus showed that in a very detailed way. In Acts 21, he gets there and he's with the congregation there. And in verse 20 of Acts 21, it says, when they heard it, they glorified the Lord. And they said to him, you see, brother, how many myriads of Jews there are who have believed, and they are all zealous for the law. But they have been informed about you, that you teach all the Jews who are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children nor walk according to the customs. Did Paul ever say that? He didn't, did he? He said circumcision is not necessary for salvation, and if you say it is, then you're a false teacher. He said we shouldn't be troubling the Gentiles about this. You don't have to become a Jew in order to be saved. So he dealt with a lot of opposition in that regard, and certainly that might mean he would not put his name to this epistle. Also, lending to the idea that Paul may have written it, in chapter 13 and verse 23. Someone read that real quick. Hebrews 13:23.
Know that our brother Timothy has been set free, with whom I shall see if he comes shortly.
Why might that mean maybe it's Paul? Yeah, they spent a lot of time together. They're very close. Right. Remember in Acts chapter 16, he comes back through, and the brethren have this man that has a great reputation. They speak well of him, and it's a young man, and Paul takes Timothy, and he goes with him on his missionary journeys. He calls him a son in the faith. They're very close. In chapter 1 of 2 Timothy talks about how at their departure there was great tears, greatly desiring to see you, being mindful of your tears, that I may be filled with joy. It's not that Paul's the only one that had a relationship with Timothy, but certainly you see that through Paul's epistles, that Timothy is mentioned specifically almost as being something that comes right along with Paul. You talk about Paul, you're going to be talking about Timothy. Where Paul is, Timothy's probably there, and so there's a close association with Timothy that Paul had, and maybe that shows that that's who wrote it. Also, the writer was in chains. So in chapter 10 and in verse 34, he says, you had compassion on me in my chains. And then in chapter 13 and verse 18, he says, pray for us. We're confident we have a good conscience in all things, desiring to live honorably. But I especially urge you to do this, that I may be restored to you the sooner. Verse 23 as well. Timothy was set free, and perhaps Paul was as well in that same regard. And so Paul was put in prison several times, wasn't he? And certainly that might lend credence to the idea that he wrote it. On top of that, and associated with this idea that he was in chains, is that he evidently, whoever it is, wrote it from Italy. In chapter 13 and verse 24, greet all those who rule over you, and all the saints, those from Italy, greet you. You'll note as we get to where these people were that were addressed, the Hebrews, one of the views is Italy because of this verse, but it seems that it would be the flip of that it's coming from Italy. Where was Paul imprisoned ultimately? In Rome, right? Which is in Italy. A couple of different times. And so it could be very well said that he wrote this in addition to other prison epistles while he was imprisoned in Rome. Also, and perhaps one of the more convincing, is that there are several phrases. Now, I say one of the more convincing probably because there are some very striking similarities in not just the language used, but the argument made based on the text. But because all men are inspired of God and it's coming from the fountainhead of the Father, then in the Word of Christ, there's going to be some similarities. And so certainly there's some reason to perhaps still doubt that Paul wrote it, but there's some pretty good reasons to believe why. Just look at a couple of them. In chapter 5, and verses 13 and 14, he says, everyone who partakes only of milk is unskilled in the word of righteousness, for he is a babe, but solid food belongs to those who are of full age. When he talks about solid food and milk in relation to the word, explain that to me. What is he talking about? What would be milk? Maybe not a specific example within the scriptures, but simple ABCs, right? The first principles is the way he says it in chapter 5 and verse 12, and then goes on in chapter 6. And so you might think about the things that he mentions here: repentance, faith, baptism, so on and so forth, the judgment, resurrection. What might be meat? Melchizedek, right? That's the context. What is this Melchizedek character, and what does he have to do with Jesus? Hebrews as an entire epistle, we just started off talking about that. Romans, I would say, is meat. Revelation, you would think, is meat. And so I think you have meat even in the books that don't seem to be meaty, but generally there are books that are easier to understand than others, and certainly just principles that are easier to understand than others. Now look at that in 1 Corinthians 3. We know Paul wrote 1 Corinthians, but while he uses the terms meat and milk, what's more striking than that is his argumentation on it, because in verse 12 of chapter 5 in Hebrews, he says, by this time you ought to be teachers, and now you're in a pickle. Because of your negligence, even though you should be able to consume meat, you can't. And that's problematic for you. In chapter 3 of 1 Corinthians, he says, I could not speak to you as to spiritual people, but as to carnal, as to babes in Christ. I fed you with milk and not solid food, and that's okay when he first came to them. He says, for until now you were not able to receive it. But then he says, and even now you are still not able. And then he calls them carnal. You're living like just regular men and being divisive and all of that because you haven't worked on your faith. And it's almost verbatim, really. Certainly the thought for thought is there. Another thing in Hebrews chapter 10 in verses 37 and 38, he quotes from Habakkuk 2. Where else do we see that? Do I have it up? Yeah. Romans 1:17. So the gospel is the power of God to salvation, for in it the righteousness of God is revealed from faith to faith, as it is written, the just shall live by faith, right? And so what Paul's arguing there is that if you want to be just, if you want to be righteous before God, faith is how he's determined that's going to happen. You have faith in the atoning sacrifice of Jesus. That's an obedient faith. Habakkuk was talking about, or God through him, how you've got to continue to trust even though you don't fully comprehend why God is using an evil nation like Babylon to punish his people who have been rebellious. And what the faithful keep doing is having faith. Perseverance. And that's really the context of chapter 10. You may not understand why you're suffering this persecution. And you may not understand why your hometown, as Jesus had prophesied years before, is going to be destroyed by a wicked nation, the Romans. Keep having faith. And so Paul quotes that as well in Galatians 3, and it would seem that he quotes it in Hebrews chapter 10. Here's something interesting in chapter 6 and verse 3. Let me jump ahead a little more, not looking at all of these in detail. But in chapter 6 and verse 3, when he's telling them to grow and to persist in that growth, he says, "This we will do if God permits." That sounds just like a phrase Christians would use, certainly. But certainly Paul used it several times, and that's pretty unique as well in the book of Hebrews. Chapter 16 and verse 7, speaking of his plans, I do not wish to see you now on the way, but I hope to stay a while with you if the Lord permits. And there are several others as well. One of the other things that we can see that might lend to Paul being the author is he's not one of the original 12. Someone will say, as we'll mention in a moment, that that's actually evidence against Paul, or that that's something that the author was dependent, therefore, in number 2 on page 7 on the testimony of others. And so it couldn't have been Paul because Paul said he's not dependent. But it kind of fits right in with this concept that he's not one of the 12, that it was originally heard by those 12, not me. You heard it before I became an apostle. And why might he put himself in that kind of context of us if he's not dependent on the testimony of the other apostles? Remember, he says, was first began to be spoken by the Lord and confirmed to us by those who heard him. If he doesn't depend on their testimony, he's got it by direct revelation. Why might he put us there, including himself?
His apostleship was often questioned.
Yeah, his apostleship was often questioned. He certainly received it himself. But that's what you see a lot of writers do. In fact, in chapter 6, and I think the book mentions this at some point, but he talks about this we will do if God permits. Was Paul hesitant in his growth? Was Paul having a problem with growth? Was the Hebrew writer having a problem with his growth? A lot of times they mention themselves within that, and it displaces any perhaps animus coming from those they're writing to. Like, why are you getting on to us? You're not perfect. Well, I'm putting myself in the same boat. We all have to do the same thing. Three reasons why some believe that it wasn't Paul. First, that the style is different from Paul. When I'm reading a commentary and an introduction portion of that commentary, and especially when the epistle has the name, like Paul or Peter, and they say, well, it doesn't sound like them, so that must not be right. It is so annoying to me because there's no way to be consistent with that argumentation. Have you ever written something one day and then written something another day, perhaps years later, where you went through an experience, or the day's just not as good, or it's worse, or whatever it may be, and it sounds a little different? Absolutely. Or it's a different purpose. And so I don't ever put any weight into this kind of style stuff. You may, it just doesn't ring true to me. He had a particular purpose. Usually he would write to Gentiles with some Jews. Now he's just writing to Jews, so no wonder it might sound a little different. Someone says, as I just mentioned, that Paul wasn't dependent on this, but maybe he's just using this to identify with the brethren. But it also doesn't say that he was dependent on this. It says that they spoke it first, and that's who we heard it from. Certainly Paul can still be true in what he says in Galatians. And then lastly, he was apostle to the Gentiles, not to the Jews. Was he exclusively an apostle to the Gentiles? The Lord himself said that Paul was chosen not just to go to the Gentiles, but that he would preach to the Jews as well. What did he do every time he entered a city? He went to the synagogues first. And so that's just a silly argument that it's not Paul. It may not be Paul, but it's not because of that argument. So now who received it? I think that we've discussed that to some degree, but where were they? They are Jewish Christians, but where were they? And here's where this term Hebrew comes back into play. It had in large part reference to language. So where you had barbarian, in reference to language in the New Testament, you had Hebrew in large part reference to language in the Old Testament. And then when you get to the New Testament, you have this distinction between Hebrews and Hellenists. And sometimes that meant Gentile versus Jew. But notice in Acts the 6th chapter what the dispute was. Keep in mind that this is before the gospel is taken to the Gentiles. It says, in those days when the number of the disciples was multiplying, there arose a complaint against the Hebrews by the Hellenists. What does he mean by the Hellenists there? Remember? The Greek-speaking Jews. New King James has a footnote that says as much. And so there were Hebrew-speaking Jews and Greek-speaking Jews. Why would there be Greek-speaking Jews? Couldn't speak Hebrew, but were just Greek-speaking at that time. This is very early, wasn't it? Pentecost brought in Jews from all over the world. And when those people obeyed the gospel, they stuck around with the apostles and with the first church established, the church established, and the first local congregation established in Jerusalem. And that's why they needed this benevolent work. And there was a dispute among those who did not speak Hebrew, but they were Jews. The reason why that's significant is that it would seem that the Hebrew-speaking Jews who still spoke Hebrew or Aramaic were in Palestine. And so it's very possible that this was written to Jews in Palestine. In the epistle, we don't see a lot of what we see in other Pauline epistles where he talks about Gentiles being a part of the covenant, or there's a dispute between Jew and Gentile, and maybe errors that are germane to that discussion. And that's because he's writing it primarily to Jews who are in Palestine. They were those who had immediately learned the gospel of Christ from the disciples, and we see that beginning on the day of Pentecost and throughout the first several chapters of Acts. There would be a danger of relapse into Judaism. That could happen anywhere, but think about what they see in Palestine every day around the temple and around the city. And then you think about the power of the words alone in Hebrews. Think about how much powerful that would be, knowing that these people are seeing these things still. That's impressive to me. And so I think Paul, or whoever wrote Hebrews, would have been saying these things with the implication, every time you see that animal being killed, every time you see your countrymen going up to the temple, remember what that means. Where they are, based on what they're still accepting and as they've rejected Christ, is that there is still not an atonement made for their sins. And think of how powerful that might be as they could see it and visualize it specifically, because they're in Palestine. Perhaps more specifically, the church at Jerusalem. In chapter 10, that applies well to Jerusalem, where they were immediately persecuted, very initially after the preaching of the gospel. As Trevor just talked about in chapter 13, it speaks about the city, and as they are in proximity to the city. And so they suffer persecution, there's no new converts. All of these reasons why it might be Jews specifically in Palestine. I think that before we dismiss, just very quickly, the probably most important thing that we didn't even talk about, but at least we're going to be studying the book, is the purpose. Its purpose was to encourage because of discouragement. They were facing opposition, as we all will do as we live by faith, and there's never an excuse to have a woe is me mentality. Jesus suffered more than any of us could ever comprehend. And as Aaron mentioned in Hebrews 12, we must look to Him and look to Him for guidance, to be with Him, and by a perfect example of what faith looks like in adversity. So I hope that this study is going to be beneficial to you, and I appreciate your patience in getting through an introductory study like this.